overheard a strange conversation between my son and daughter-in-law. I found out they were plotting to send me to a nursing home, steal my inheritance, and make me look insane. I installed cameras in the house and discovered something terrible. A week later, I vanished, leaving a recording on the table. 26 missed calls. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought I'd become invisible in my own home. At 62, I'd imagined my golden years differently. Maybe traveling with Margaret, watching our grandchildren grow up, enjoying the fruits of 40 years of hard work. Instead, I was sitting alone in the house we'd built together, 2 years after her funeral, wondering why my own son looked at me like I was already dead. The morning it all changed started like any other Tuesday. I was in my study, going through Margaret's old photo albums, when I heard voices drifting from the kitchen, Peter's deep baritone mixed with Arya's higher pitch. But there was something in their tone that made me pause, something secretive. I set down the album and moved quietly toward the hallway. After Margaret's stroke, I'd developed this habit of moving carefully through the house, as if making too much noise might disturb her memory somehow. Now that habit served a different purpose. The lawyer said we need documented evidence of his mental decline, Arya was saying. Her voice carried that edge it always had when she was planning something. I'd noticed it before at family dinners, when she'd convince Peter to make decisions he'd later regret. My heart started beating faster. Mental decline. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear every word. I don't know, Arya. Dad seems fine to me most days. Sure, he forgets things sometimes, but don't we all? Peter's voice wavered with uncertainty. My son had always been a follower, even as a child. Margaret used to worry about that. Peter, listen to me. Arya's voice dropped to that manipulative whisper she used when she wanted something. Your father is sitting on $850,000. That money could secure our future, pay off our debts, give us the life we deserve. But if we wait until he actually loses his mind, there might not be anything left. $850,000. She'd calculated it exactly. Every penny of Margaret's life insurance, my retirement savings, the value of this house, my life's work reduced to a number in her scheming mind. But Mom always said he should enjoy his retirement, Peter protested weakly. Your mother is dead, Peter. Arya's words hit like ice water. And your father is forgetting more each day. Last week he couldn't remember where he put his keys. Yesterday he asked me twice what day it was. He's declining, whether you want to see it or not. I stood there, my back against the hallway wall, feeling something crumble inside my chest. Those little moments she mentioned, the keys, the dates, they were normal things. Everyone misplaces keys. Everyone loses track of time occasionally. But she was weaponizing my humanity, turning my small, everyday struggles into evidence against me. The facility I found is actually quite nice, Arya continued. Sunset Manor. They specialize in memory care. The staff is trained to handle people in his condition. His condition, as if I had some terminal disease instead of the normal forgetfulness that comes with age and grief. How much would it cost? Peter asked, and I could hear him weakening, being drawn into her web. $3,500 a month. But Peter, think about it. We'd have access to his accounts to pay for his care. We'd be his legal guardians. We could make sure he's safe and comfortable while securing our financial future. It's really the best thing for everyone. $3,500 a month. In a place where I'd be locked away, medicated into compliance, while they lived in my house and spent my money. The betrayal cut so deep, I had to grip the wall to keep from collapsing. I still feel like we're rushing this, Peter said, but his resistance was fading. I knew my son's voice well enough to hear the capitulation creeping in. We can't wait, sweetheart. These things take time to arrange. The legal paperwork alone will take weeks. And what if he has another episode like last month? Another episode? I racked my brain trying to remember what she could mean. Then it hit me. The day I'd felt dizzy and confused when I couldn't remember eating breakfast. I'd attributed it to grief, to the way sorrow sometimes made everything feel foggy. But now hearing the calculation in Arya's voice, I wondered if there was another explanation. The doctor said older people often have these spells, Peter said, grasping for justification. Exactly, and they'll only get worse. Stephen is 62, Peter. He could live another 20 years. 20 years of decline, of medical bills, of us watching everything Margaret worked for get eaten up by healthcare costs. Or we can act now, while he's still functional enough to sign the papers, and make sure he gets proper care while preserving what's left for our family. Our family. I wasn't even part of their family anymore, just an obstacle to be managed. I heard chairs scraping against the kitchen floor and realized they were getting up. My heart hammered as I crept back to my study, settling into my chair just as their footsteps approached. "Dad?" Peter's voice called from the doorway. "How are you feeling today?" I looked up at my son, this man I'd raised, taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, walked to his first day of school. His eyes weren't looking at me with love anymore. They were assessing, calculating, looking for signs of the decline his wife had convinced him to see. "I'm fine, son," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "Just going through some of your mother's things." "That's nice, Dad." His smile felt rehearsed. "Are you remembering to eat lunch? It's almost 2 o'clock. It was a trap. A simple question designed to catch me in confusion. I glanced at the clock on my desk. 1:45. "I had a sandwich earlier," I lied, not trusting whatever food they might offer me now. Arya appeared behind Peter, her face arranged in false concern. "Stephen, you know you can always ask us if you need help with anything. We're here for you." The kindness in her voice made my stomach turn. She was already practicing for the doctors, the lawyers, the social workers who would need to believe she cared about my welfare. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. After they left, I sat in the growing shadows of late afternoon, Margaret's photo album open in my lap. In one picture, she was holding baby Peter, both of them glowing with joy. In another, we were at Peter's wedding day, Arya in white, all of us smiling for the camera. I'd been so happy that day, thinking I was gaining a daughter. Now I understood I'd been losing a son instead. I closed the album and walked to the window. Outside, the oak tree Margaret and I had planted 30 years ago swayed in the breeze, its leaves just starting to turn. I'd always imagined I'd watch it change through many more seasons, maybe sitting on the porch with grandchildren someday. But if Arya had her way, I'd be watching it through the barred windows of Sunset Manor, medicated and forgotten, while she sat in Margaret's chair and spent Margaret's money. That's when I made my decision. If they wanted to play games with my mind and my future, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. I needed evidence, proof of their intentions and their methods. I needed to fight back, but carefully, quietly. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man whose faculties were slipping away. They had no idea how wrong they were. The next morning I drove to the electronics store downtown with hands that trembled slightly on the steering wheel. Not from fear, but from anger that had been building all night like pressure in a kettle. I'd barely slept, replaying Arya's cold calculations and Peter's weak protests over and over in my mind. The young clerk at Best Electronics looked at me skeptically when I asked about hidden cameras. I suppose a 62-year-old man buying surveillance equipment raised questions, but I kept my voice steady and my story simple. "I've been having some break-ins in my neighborhood," I told him. "Need to keep an eye on things when I'm out." He showed me several options, but I chose the smallest ones. Tiny cameras that looked like smoke detectors, picture frames, even electrical outlets. The technology amazed me. These devices could record for hours, store everything digitally, and I could monitor them from my phone. "You'll want to place them strategically," the clerk explained, warming up once he realized I was a serious customer with cash to spend. Kitchen, living room, main hallway, anywhere people gather and talk. $340 later, I drove home with a bag full of surveillance equipment and a growing sense of purpose. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt like I was taking control of something. I waited until afternoon, when Peter was at work and Arya had gone to her yoga class, before installing the cameras. My hands were steadier now, focused on the technical challenge. I placed one in the kitchen, disguised as a small radio on the counter. Another went in the living room, hidden inside a decorative clock Margaret had loved. The third I installed in the hallway, replacing the smoke detector with an identical one that contained a lens. The hardest part was downloading the app and figuring out how to connect everything to my phone. Technology had never been my strong suit, but desperation made me patient. I spent 2 hours reading instructions, calling the customer service number twice, and finally getting everything working. That evening at dinner, I watched Peter and Arya differently. Every glance between them, every careful word, took on new meaning. I was hyper-aware that my hidden cameras were capturing everything, building my evidence one conversation at a time. "Dad, you seem tired today," Arya observed, cutting her chicken with precise movements. "Are you sleeping well?" "Well enough," I replied, taking a small bite of the casserole she'd prepared. It tasted slightly bitter, but I attributed that to my growing paranoia about everything they did. Maybe you should see Dr. Harrison again, Peter suggested, just for a routine checkup. Make sure everything's okay. Dr. Harrison. I wondered if they'd already spoken to him, planted seeds about my supposed mental decline. The thought made my stomach clench and I pushed the casserole away. I'm not very hungry tonight, I said. You need to eat, Stephen. Arya's voice carried that false concern again. Proper nutrition is so important at your age. At your age. Everything was about my age now, as if reaching 62 had automatically made me incompetent. After dinner, I retreated to my study, claiming I wanted to read. Instead, I opened the surveillance app on my phone with shaking fingers. The cameras were working perfectly. I could see the kitchen from the radio's angle, the living room from the clock, the hallway from above. More importantly, I could hear everything. The first recording that chilled me came around 9 o'clock. I was in my study with the door closed when I heard Peter's voice through the app. She's right, you know, he was saying to Arya in the kitchen. Dad pushed his food around tonight, barely ate anything. And did you see how confused he looked when you mentioned Dr. Harrison? I've been documenting everything, Arya replied, and I heard papers rustling. Look, I started this journal 3 weeks ago, Tuesday the 14th. Stephen couldn't remember where he put his glasses, searched for 20 minutes. Friday the 17th, asked me twice what time his doctor appointment was. Monday the 21st, stood in the kitchen for several minutes, seemed lost, my hands clenched around my phone. She'd been stalking me in my own home, turning every normal moment of distraction into evidence of dementia. The glasses she mentioned, I'd later found them in the car where I'd left them after driving to the pharmacy. The doctor appointment question, I'd asked because I was double-checking, being responsible. Standing in the kitchen, I'd been trying to remember what Margaret used to cook when she was sad, hoping to honor her memory somehow. But in Arya's journal, I was already a patient instead of a person. The lawyer said we need at least 30 documented incidents, she continued. I'm almost there. And if we can get Dr. Harrison to note cognitive concerns during a visit, we'll have medical backing. It still feels wrong, Peter said, but his voice lacked conviction. Peter, honey, look at me. I could picture Arya taking his hands, using her physical presence to manipulate his emotions. Your father is declining whether we act or not. At least this way, we can ensure he gets proper care and our family's financial security isn't destroyed in the process. Think about our future children. Think about the life we could give them. Our future children. They were planning their lives around my money, around my disappearance from their world. The recording continued, but I had to stop listening for a moment. I sat in Margaret's old chair, the one I'd moved into my study after she died because it still smelled faintly of her perfume, and tried to process the scope of their betrayal. They weren't just planning to warehouse me. They were systematically building a case that I was incompetent, documenting my life like I was already a laboratory specimen. Every interaction we'd had for weeks had been a lie, a performance designed to gather ammunition against me. I forced myself to keep listening. The conversation had moved to logistics. The facility has an opening in 6 weeks, Arya was saying. If we file the paperwork now, we could have guardianship established by then. 6 weeks, Peter repeated. That's fast. It has to be fast, Peter. Every day we wait is another day for something to go wrong. What if he falls and breaks his hip? What if he has a stroke like your mother? What if he decides to change his will or give money to some charity? The fear in her voice when she mentioned me changing my will was telling. They weren't just stealing my freedom. They were stealing my choices, my right to decide how my life's work would be used. I checked the other cameras. The living room was empty, but the hallway camera picked up their voices as they headed upstairs to bed. Tomorrow I'll call Dr. Harrison's office, Arya said. Schedule Stephen for a comprehensive evaluation. The doctor needs to see him before we can move forward with the legal proceedings. And if Dad refuses to go? Peter asked. He won't refuse. I'll tell him it's time for his annual physical. Men his age need regular checkups anyway. He'll never suspect it's anything more than routine care. Their footsteps faded as they reached the second floor, but I kept listening to the recordings late into the night. I needed to understand every detail of their plan, every timeline, every contingency they'd considered. Around midnight, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. While reviewing the kitchen footage from earlier that evening, I noticed Arya doing something strange with my water glass while I was in the bathroom. She'd taken a small bottle from her purse and added something to my drink, stirring it quickly before I returned. I rewound the footage and watched again. There was no mistaking what I saw. Arya was drugging me. Suddenly, the bitter taste of tonight's casserole made sense. The dizzy spell from last month that she'd used as evidence of my decline. The occasional confusion, the slight tremor in my hands some mornings. These weren't signs of aging or grief. She was poisoning me systematically, creating the very symptoms she was documenting as proof of my mental deterioration. I sat in the dark study, Margaret's perfume still clinging to the chair, and realized that my situation was far more dangerous than I'd initially understood. This wasn't just about money or convenience. If Arya was willing to drug me to create evidence of dementia, what else might she be willing to do? How far would she go to get what she wanted? And more importantly, how much time did I have before her chemicals did permanent damage to my mind or body? I looked at the surveillance app on my phone, at the real-time feeds from my own home, and began planning my next move. If they wanted to play with fire, they were about to discover that this old man still had plenty of fight left in him. But I had to be smarter than them, more careful, more patient, because now I knew that my life quite literally depended on it. The next 3 days I became a detective in my own home. I stopped eating anything Arya prepared, claiming my appetite was poor. Instead, I made my own simple meals when they weren't around, or ate from sealed packages I could verify hadn't been tampered with. The improvement in how I felt was almost immediate. The morning fog that had been clouding my thoughts for weeks began to lift. The slight tremor in my hands disappeared. Most telling of all, I could think clearly again, remember details with the sharpness I'd had before Margaret's death. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been grieving myself into confusion. I'd been systematically poisoned. My surveillance system captured everything now. I'd learned to be patient, to watch and wait. Arya had no idea that every casual conversation, every private moment with Peter, every calculated move was being recorded in high definition. Thursday morning, while Peter was at his engineering firm and I pretended to nap in my study, Arya made a phone call that changed everything. I watched through the kitchen camera as she pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number she had memorized. "Dr. Martinez, it's Arya Holloway. Yes, Peter's wife." Her voice carried that false sweetness she used when manipulating strangers. "I wanted to give you an update on my father-in-law's condition. Dr. Martinez, not Dr. Harrison, our family physician. This was someone else entirely. The Risperdal is working perfectly," she continued, and my blood went cold. "He's showing all the confusion and disorientation we discussed. The hand tremors started about 2 weeks ago, just like you predicted. Risperdal," I recognized the name from medication commercials, an antipsychotic drug used to treat schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. She'd been feeding me antipsychotic medication to create symptoms of mental illness. "How much longer do you think we need to continue?" Arya asked, pacing around my kitchen like she owned it. "The legal proceedings should begin next week, and I want to make sure his condition appears stable enough for the evaluation, but severe enough to justify guardianship." There was a pause as she listened to the response. 12 milligrams daily, split between his morning coffee and dinner. "Sometimes I add extra to his water if he's having what Peter calls a good day. We can't have him appearing too competent during the assessment." She was discussing dosages like I was a laboratory rat. My own daughter-in-law was conducting medical experiments on me with the help of some corrupt doctor who was willing to prescribe controlled substances for someone who wasn't even his patient. "The facility is expecting him by the 15th of next month," she continued, Sunset Manor. "They specialize in cases like this, and they don't ask too many questions about how patients arrive there. The monthly fee is $3,500, which will pay from his accounts once the guardianship is established." Another pause, then laughter that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Dr. Martinez, you're terrible, but you're right. Once he's properly medicated and supervised, the inheritance issues will resolve themselves naturally. Peter estimates we're looking at $850,000 in total assets. Plus, this house is worth at least another $400,000. $1.25 million. She'd calculated my entire life's worth down to the penny. "The beauty of it is that everything looks completely legitimate," she continued. "A concerned family dealing with an aging parent's declining mental health. Peter has been so worried about his father's condition. We're just trying to do what's best for everyone involved." The conversation continued, but I had heard enough to understand the full scope of their conspiracy. This wasn't just theft. It was a sophisticated medical fraud involving a corrupt physician and systematic poisoning designed to incapacitate me mentally and physically. But the worst revelation was still to come. That evening, when Peter arrived home from work, I watched through the living room camera as Arya updated him on her phone conversation. "Dr. Martinez thinks we should increase the dosage," she told my son, settling beside him on the couch that had been Margaret's favorite spot for reading. "Dad's been too alert lately, too questioning. We need him more compliant for the evaluation next week." "Increase it to what?" Peter asked, and I held my breath, waiting for his response. Part of me still hoped, still prayed that my son had some line he wouldn't cross. 15 milligrams daily. Dr. Martinez says that should keep him properly sedated without causing obvious symptoms that might raise red flags during the medical assessment. Peter was quiet for a long moment. I watched his face on the camera, looking for some sign of conscience, some flicker of the boy I'd raised to know right from wrong. "What if it's too much?" he finally asked. "What if it hurts him?" My heart leaped. Maybe there was still hope. Maybe my son still had some humanity left. Arya's response shattered that hope completely. "Peter, honey, we've been through this." Her voice took on that patient tone she used when explaining something to a child. "Your father is 62 years old. Men his age have heart problems, strokes, all kinds of medical issues. If something happens while he's taking medication for his mental condition, who's going to question it?" The room went silent, except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. She wasn't just talking about drugging me into compliance. She was discussing my death as if it were a minor inconvenience to be managed. "The insurance policies alone are worth $200,000, she continued. "Combined with everything else, we'd be set for life. And think about it, Peter. Would your father really want to live like this? Confused, helpless, a burden to everyone who loves him." "I guess you're right," Peter said quietly, and I watched my son sign my death warrant with those 4 words. "I know this is hard, sweetheart," Arya said, moving closer to him on the couch. "But we're being merciful. We're saving him from years of decline and saving ourselves from watching him deteriorate. It's better this way." I turned off the surveillance app and sat in the darkness of my study, trying to process what I'd just heard. They weren't planning to put me in a nursing home. They were planning to kill me. The drugs, the fake medical evaluations, the legal guardianship. It was all designed to make my death look natural and inevitable. A 62-year-old man with documented mental health issues taking antipsychotic medication. If I died from a heart attack or stroke, who would investigate? Who would question whether the medications had been prescribed legitimately or administered properly? I thought about Margaret, about the promises we'd made to each other about growing old together. She'd died too young, but she'd died with dignity, surrounded by love. They were planning to rob me of even that basic human right. The next morning, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of pretending to drink the coffee Arya prepared, I poured it into a small glass jar while she was distracted and hid it in my study. I did the same with the water glass she handed me at dinner, and the soup she insisted I needed because I looked pale. By the end of the week, I had collected 5 samples of food and beverages they'd given me. More importantly, I'd recorded every conversation about their plans, including the specific names of medications and the identity of the corrupt doctor helping them. But I also realized something terrifying. They were escalating. The timeline had moved up. Arya had scheduled my evaluation for the following Tuesday. The guardianship papers were already prepared. The nursing home had been contacted. And if Peter's uncomfortable questions meant anything, they were planning for me not to survive much longer after arriving at Sunset Manor. I had 4 days to figure out how to save my own life. 4 days to turn the tables on people who had already decided I was better off dead. 4 days to prove that this old man still had enough fight in him to defeat opponents who had underestimated him completely. I looked at Margaret's photograph on my desk, at her kind eyes and gentle smile, and made her a promise. I was going to survive this. I was going to make them pay for what they'd done. And when it was all over, I was going to make sure no other family ever had to go through what they'd put me through. The war was just beginning, and they had no idea what they'd awakened. Saturday morning, I woke up with the clarity I hadn't felt in months. No more fog, no more trembling hands, no more confusion about simple things. The difference was startling. For weeks, I'd attributed my symptoms to grief and age, never imagining that someone who claimed to care about me was systematically poisoning me. I had 72 hours before Arya's fabricated medical evaluation. 72 hours to orchestrate the most important plan of my life. My first stop was the bank. I'd been doing business with First National for 37 years, long enough that the manager, Rebecca Chen, knew me personally. She'd handled Margaret's life insurance claim and had been nothing but compassionate during those difficult weeks. "Stephen, good to see you," she said, welcoming me into her office. "How can I help you today?" I sat down carefully, having rehearsed this conversation in my mind. "Rebecca, I need to make some changes to my accounts. I'm concerned about financial security as I get older." She nodded understandingly. "Of course. What did you have in mind?" "I want to transfer the majority of my assets to a different type of account, something that would require multiple authorizations to access, with built-in delays for large withdrawals." Rebecca pulled up my account information on her computer. "We have several options for that kind of protection. Are you concerned about fraud, or is this more about estate planning?" "Both," I said, which was true enough. "I want to make sure that if anything happens to my mental faculties in the future, there are safeguards in place." Over the next hour, we restructured my finances completely. $700,000 went into a trust account that required not only my signature, but also approval from the bank's trust department and a 48-hour waiting period for any withdrawal over $5,000. Another $100,000 went into a separate account at a different bank entirely, one that Peter and Arya knew nothing about. The remaining $50,000 stayed in my regular checking account, enough to look normal to anyone monitoring my finances, but not enough to fund their schemes. "I'm also going to need detailed records of all account activity for the past 6 months," I told Rebecca. "And I'd like to set up additional security measures. Anyone calling about my accounts should have to provide not just my social security number, but also answer questions about my personal history." "That's very wise, Stephen," she said, making notes. "Identity theft targeting seniors is unfortunately common these days." If only she knew how close to home this particular theft was coming from. My next stop was more difficult. I drove to the law office of James Patterson, an attorney I'd known since high school. Jim had handled our real estate transactions over the years and had been Margaret's choice for our wills. "Stephen, I'm sorry I haven't called since Margaret's funeral," he said, shaking my hand warmly. "How are you holding up?" "Better than expected, actually." "Jim, I need your help with something sensitive." I spent the next 2 hours telling him everything. I showed him the recorded conversations on my phone, played the audio of Arya discussing medication dosages with Dr. Martinez, explained about the liquid samples I'd collected. Jim's expression grew darker with each revelation. "Stephen, this is attempted murder," he said finally. "We're not talking about financial exploitation here. This woman has been poisoning you with prescription medication. That's felony assault at minimum." "I know," I said, "but I need to be smart about this. If I go to the police now, it's my word against theirs. Peter will claim I'm confused, and Arya will produce her journal full of documented mental decline. They'll say I'm paranoid, possibly dangerous." Jim nodded grimly. "You're right. We need more evidence. Have you considered what your end game is here?" That was the question I'd been wrestling with all morning. I want them stopped. I want justice. And I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," Jim said, pulling out a legal pad. "First, we're going to get those liquid samples tested immediately. I know a private lab that can have results back within 24 hours. Second, we're going to document everything you've recorded and create backup copies stored in multiple locations." He continued writing as he talked. "Third, we're going to set up a dead man's switch. If anything happens to you, if you disappear or end up hospitalized or die suddenly, everything gets released automatically to the police, the medical board, and the media." "You think they'd actually kill me?" I asked, though I knew the answer from their recorded conversations. "Stephen, they've already been trying to kill you slowly. The only question is how patient they're willing to be." We spent another hour planning. Jim would handle the legal preparations while I gathered more evidence, but most importantly, he helped me understand that I needed to disappear before Tuesday's fake medical evaluation. Once they get you into that doctor's office, once they have you declared incompetent, you lose all your legal rights, he explained. Even if we prove fraud later, the damage could be irreversible. You need to vanish before they can spring their trap. That afternoon, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I was going to leave everything I'd built with Margaret and disappear completely, but not forever, and not without purpose. I began my preparations methodically. First, I visited 3 different ATM machines, withdrawing the maximum daily limit from each. $1,500 in cash, enough to survive for several weeks if necessary. Next, I stopped at a storage facility across town and rented a unit under a false name, paying 6 months in advance with cash. I transferred copies of all my evidence there, along with backup recordings and written summaries of everything I'd discovered. The hardest part was packing. I couldn't take much without arousing suspicion, but I needed enough clothes and personal items to survive an extended absence. I settled on filling one small suitcase, which I hid in the trunk of my car. Sunday evening, I sat down at my computer and wrote 3 letters. The first was to Jim, authorizing him to act on my behalf and outlining my complete plan. The second was to Rebecca at the bank, confirming our earlier arrangements and adding additional security measures. The third letter was the most important one. It was addressed to Peter and Arya, and I planned to leave it where they'd find it immediately after discovering my absence. As I wrote, I could hear them in the living room below, watching television and discussing their plans for my evaluation. Arya was explaining how she'd already spoken to the staff at Sunset Manor, how they were expecting a new patient who would need intensive medication management. "The room I selected is on the 3rd floor," she said. "No direct access to exits, and the windows don't open. Perfect for someone with wandering tendencies." "How long do you think he'll need to stay there?" Peter asked. "Not long," Arya replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Dr. Martinez says that with his age and health conditions, the stress of institutionalization often leads to rapid decline. 6 months, maybe less. 6 months. They were giving me 6 months to live, and they were planning to spend every day of it stealing my money and erasing my existence." I finished the letter and sealed it in an envelope with their names on the front. Tomorrow morning, after they left for their respective jobs, I would implement the final phase of my plan. But first, I had one more recording to make. I wanted to capture their conversation from tonight, their casual discussion of my impending imprisonment and death. I needed that evidence for what came next. As I listened to them plan my destruction, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the cold, calculating anger of a man who'd been pushed too far. They thought they were dealing with a confused old widower who would go quietly into whatever hell they'd prepared for him. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Margaret used to say I was too trusting, too willing to see the best in people even when they showed me their worst. She'd been right, and it had nearly cost me everything. But Margaret had also known something else about me that I'd almost forgotten in my grief. When cornered, when fighting for something that mattered, I was capable of strategic thinking that could outmaneuver people half my age. Tomorrow, Peter and Arya would discover that the helpless old man they'd been manipulating was about to become their worst nightmare. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and they had no idea what was coming for them. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I watched Peter leave for work at exactly 7:45, just like he had every day for the past 3 years. Arya followed 20 minutes later, heading to what she claimed was her part-time job at a boutique. Though I now suspected she spent most of her time coordinating my destruction with Dr. Martinez and researching nursing home policies. I waited another 30 minutes to ensure they wouldn't return for forgotten items, then began the most important performance of my life. First, I retrieved the surveillance equipment and downloaded every single recording onto multiple flash drives. Months of evidence. Arya discussing medication dosages, Peter agreeing to increase my treatment, conversations about my death being convenient, planning sessions about spending my money. All of it captured in crystal clear digital quality. I placed one flash drive in the envelope with my letter to them. The others went to secure locations they'd never think to search. Next, I staged my disappearance carefully. I left the letter prominently displayed on the kitchen table where they'd see it immediately. Beside it, I placed my wallet, my house keys, and my cell phone, but only after removing the SIM card, which I'd destroy later. The letter itself was deliberately cryptic. Peter and Arya, I know what you've been doing to me. I know about the medication, the fake doctor visits, and your plans for Sunset Manor. I won't be your victim anymore. Don't try to find me. Don't call the police. If you do, everything I've recorded will become public immediately. You have 48 hours to think about what you've done. Stephen. I wanted them panicked but not desperate enough to do something stupid that might hurt innocent people. At 11:30, I drove my car to the long-term parking lot at the regional airport, 45 minutes from town. I'd researched this carefully. Cars could sit there for weeks without attracting attention, and the security cameras would show me arriving alone, suggesting I'd flown somewhere. From the airport, I took a taxi to a used car dealership in the next county over. I paid cash for a 15-year-old Honda Civic that ran well but looked completely ordinary, the kind of car that would blend into traffic anywhere. My destination was a small cabin I'd rented under a false name near Lake Harrison, about 2 hours away. I'd found it through a classified ad, paid the owner in cash for a month's rent, and told him I was a writer needing solitude to finish a book. The cabin was isolated but had internet access, which I'd need for the next phase of my plan. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was settled in my temporary hideout with all my evidence, watching the surveillance cameras at my house through my phone. The system was still active, still recording, and I had a perfect view of Peter and Arya's world falling apart. They discovered my disappearance at 5:23. I watched through the kitchen camera as Peter came home from work, calling out his usual greeting. "Dad, I'm home. How was your day?" Silence. He walked into the kitchen and stopped dead when he saw the letter on the table. I could see his face clearly as he read it, watched the color drain from his cheeks as the implications hit him. "Arya!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Arya, get home now!" She must have been close because she arrived within 10 minutes, rushing through the front door with her keys still in her hand. "What's wrong? What happened? Where's your father?" Peter handed her the letter without speaking. I watched her face transform as she read, saw the calculation behind her eyes as she processed this unexpected development. "He's bluffing," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "He doesn't know anything. He's just paranoid." "Then where is he, Arya? Where's his car? Where's his phone?" She picked up my abandoned cell phone from the table, frantically pressing buttons. "It's been factory reset. There's nothing on it." That wasn't true, of course. I'd simply removed the SIM card, but the panic in her voice told me my psychological warfare was working. "Call Dr. Martinez," Peter said, pacing around the kitchen like a caged animal. "Find out if Dad somehow figured out about the medication." "I can't call Dr. Martinez from here," Arya snapped. "What if Stephen really is recording us? What if this whole house is bugged?" The irony was perfect. They were paranoid about surveillance in their own home, never imagining that I'd been watching them for weeks. Over the next hour, I witnessed the complete breakdown of their conspiracy. They searched every room, looking for hidden cameras or recording devices. They whispered to each other in corners, afraid that their own voices might be captured. They called my cell phone repeatedly, getting only voicemail. But the most satisfying moment came when Arya tried to access my bank accounts online. I watched her sit at my computer typing furiously, growing more frustrated with each failed login attempt. I'd changed all the passwords, of course, but she didn't know that yet. "The accounts are locked," she told Peter, her voice rising toward hysteria. "I can't get into any of them. Not the checking account, not the savings, nothing." "What do you mean locked?" "I mean they're frozen, Peter. Inaccessible." He must have done something to them before he left. Peter sank into a chair, the full scope of their disaster beginning to dawn on him. "The house payment is due next week, and didn't you tell Dr. Martinez we'd pay him $5,000 once the guardianship went through?" "Shut up about Dr. Martinez," Arya hissed, glancing around as if I might be hiding behind the furniture. "We don't know what Stephen heard or recorded. We can't say anything incriminating." But of course, they already had. Months of incriminating conversations, all neatly cataloged and stored in multiple secure locations. My phone buzzed with the first call at 6:15, then again at 6:17. By 7 o'clock, I had 26 missed calls from my home number and Peter's cell phone. I let them all go to voicemail, knowing that each unanswered ring would increase their panic. The messages they left grew increasingly desperate. "Dad, please call me back. We need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding." Stephen, it's Arya. I don't know what you think you heard, but we can explain everything." "Dad, please. We're worried about you. Just tell us where you are." And finally, around 10 o'clock, "Stephen, you're making a mistake. Come home now, and we can work this out. But if you don't come back, if you try to hurt this family, you'll regret it." That last message, clearly from Arya, told me everything I needed to know about her true nature. Even in defeat, she was threatening me. I made one call that night to Jim Patterson. "Stephen, thank God. Are you safe?" "I'm fine, Jim. Did you get the lab results?" "Yes, and they're exactly what we expected. Risperdal, just like you suspected. Enough to cause all the symptoms they documented, administered over a period of several weeks." "Good. Have you prepared the packages for the authorities?" "Everything's ready. Police, medical board, District Attorney's Office, and the FBI's Elder Abuse Task Force. The moment you give me the word, or if anything happens to you, it all gets delivered simultaneously." "Perfect. Give me 48 hours to let them stew in their own panic, then we'll spring the trap. That night, I slept better than I had in months. No drugs in my system, no one monitoring my every move, no one planning my death while pretending to care about my welfare. For the first time since Margaret's passing, I felt truly free. But my freedom had come at a price. I was now completely alone, cut off from my former life, dependent on my own resources and planning. If I'd made any mistakes, if there were any flaws in my strategy, I might never see justice for what they'd done to me. Still, as I lay in the small cabin bed, listening to night sounds from the lake, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a victim, but the quiet confidence of someone who'd taken control of his own destiny. Tomorrow would bring the next phase of my plan. Peter and Arya thought they'd lost track of me, thought they were dealing with an unpredictable old man who might do anything. They were right about that last part. I was unpredictable now. But I wasn't the confused, helpless victim they'd been manipulating for months. I was someone who'd been pushed to his breaking point and had decided to push back with everything he had left. Wednesday morning, exactly 48 hours after my disappearance, I called Jim Patterson from a payphone outside a diner near Lake Harrison. "It's time," I said simply. "Are you sure, Stephen? Once we do this, there's no going back." I thought about Margaret, about the life we'd built together, about the trust I'd placed in people who'd used it to nearly destroy me. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Understood. The packages go out in 1 hour. While Jim coordinated with the authorities, I drove back toward town for the final act of this drama. I had one more stop to make before justice caught up with Peter and Arya. I parked the Honda across the street from my house and waited. Through my surveillance app, I could see them inside, still frantic, still searching for solutions that didn't exist. Arya was on the phone constantly, probably trying to reach Dr. Martinez or cancel arrangements with Sunset Manor. Peter sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd done. At exactly 11:30, 3 police cars pulled into my driveway. I watched through the cameras as Detective Sarah Morrison, a woman I'd met briefly at a community safety meeting years earlier, rang the doorbell. Behind her stood 2 uniformed officers and a man in a suit who I assumed was from the district attorney's office. Peter opened the door, his face pale and drawn. "Peter Holloway? I'm Detective Morrison with the Metro Police. We need to speak with you and your wife about your father, Stephen Holloway." "He's missing," Peter said quickly. "We filed a report yesterday. We've been worried sick." "I'm sure you have," Detective Morrison replied with the kind of professional neutrality that suggested she knew much more than she was letting on. "May we come in?" I had positioned myself in the used Honda where I could see both the house and my phone screen. This was the moment I'd been planning for weeks, the culmination of everything I'd endured and discovered. Through the kitchen camera, I watched as Detective Morrison placed a digital recorder on my dining room table, the same table where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd planned our retirement, where I'd grieved her loss. "Mr. Holloway, Mrs. Holloway, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, illegal administration of controlled substances, and attempted fraud." Arya shot to her feet. "This is ridiculous. We haven't done anything wrong. Stephen is confused, possibly dangerous. He's been having episodes of paranoia and aggression." Detective Morrison consulted a folder in her hands. "Mrs. Holloway, we have recorded evidence of you discussing medication dosages with Dr. Luis Martinez, who has already been taken into custody this morning. We have laboratory analysis of liquid samples showing the presence of Risperdal in beverages intended for your father-in-law. We have documented evidence of your planning to gain guardianship through fraudulent medical evaluations." The color drained from Arya's face completely. Peter made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Where is he?" Peter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where's my father?" "Safe," Detective Morrison replied, "and fully aware of everything you've done to him." That was my cue. I got out of the Honda and walked across the street toward my own front door, toward the house where I'd been poisoned and manipulated and nearly destroyed by people who were supposed to love me. Peter saw me first through the living room window. His face crumpled, and for a moment I saw the little boy he'd once been, the child who used to run to me when he was scared or hurt. But that child was gone, replaced by someone who'd been willing to drug his own father to death for money. I walked through my front door for the first time in 3 days, feeling like a stranger in my own home. "Hello, Peter." Arya. Arya lunged toward me, fury overriding her fear. "You bastard! You manipulative, vindictive old man! We were trying to help you." One of the uniformed officers stepped between us, but I held up my hand. "Let her talk," I said calmly. "I want everyone to hear exactly who she really is." "You were declining," she screamed, all pretense of concern finally abandoned. "You were forgetting things, acting confused. We were protecting you from yourself." "You were poisoning me," I replied, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "You were feeding me antipsychotic medication to create the very symptoms you claim to have been treating. You were planning to have me declared incompetent so you could steal everything Margaret and I worked 40 years to build." Peter finally found his voice. "Dad, I thought we were helping. Arya said you were getting worse, that you needed professional care." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised from infancy, taught to walk and ride a bike and drive a car. "Peter, I have recordings of you discussing increasing my medication dosage. I have recordings of both of you talking about how convenient it would be if I died. You knew exactly what you were doing." The fight went out of him then. His shoulders sagged, and he couldn't meet my eyes. Detective Morrison stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway, we'll need your full statement, but right now we need to take these two into custody." I watched as they handcuffed my son and daughter-in-law in my own living room. Arya continued ranting about my selfishness and ingratitude, but Peter said nothing. He looked like a man who'd finally woken up from a nightmare to discover it was all real. After they were taken away, I sat alone in the house that had nearly become my prison. Detective Morrison stayed to take my statement, and I told her everything. The months of manipulation, the systematic poisoning, the fake medical consultations, the plans for my institutionalization and eventual death. "Mr. Holloway," she said when I finished, "I've been working elder abuse cases for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite this calculated. Your quick thinking and evidence collection probably saved your life." 3 months later, the legal proceedings were complete. Dr. Martinez lost his medical license and received 18 months in federal prison for his role in the conspiracy. Arya was sentenced to 5 years for elder abuse and illegal administration of controlled substances. Peter, who cooperated with prosecutors and showed genuine remorse, received 2 years probation and was required to pay restitution for all medical expenses related to treating the effects of the drugs they'd given me. I never spoke to my son again after his sentencing. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness, and knowing that he'd been willing to discuss my death as a convenience was a wound that would never heal. But my story doesn't end with their punishment. 6 months after that nightmare ended, I did something Margaret and I had always talked about but never found the courage to do. I sold the house with all its painful memories and moved to a small coastal town in North Carolina where nobody knew my history. I bought a modest cottage 3 blocks from the ocean and began the process of rebuilding my life from scratch. I volunteered at a local senior center, where I quietly helped other elderly people recognize the signs of family financial abuse. I started a small support group for people who'd been victimized by relatives they'd trusted. Most importantly, I began to heal. The drugs Arya had fed me caused no permanent damage, but the emotional scars took longer to fade. I had to relearn how to trust my own perceptions, my own memories, my own judgment about people. 1 year after my escape, I met Eleanor at the farmer's market. She was 70, recently widowed, with kind eyes and a laugh that reminded me of Margaret's. We started as friends, 2 people who understood loss and betrayal, who knew that trust was something precious that had to be earned slowly. Eleanor had her own story of family members who'd tried to exploit her vulnerability after her husband's death. She'd been stronger than I was initially, more suspicious of their motives, but she understood the peculiar pain of being betrayed by people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. We didn't rush into anything romantic. Instead, we built something better, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared experiences, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving other people's attempts to destroy you. Today, as I write this 2 years after my disappearance, I'm sitting on the porch of the cottage Eleanor and I now share. The ocean breeze carries the scent of salt and possibility. And for the first time since Margaret's death, I can honestly say I'm happy. I think about Peter sometimes, wonder if prison changed him, if he ever truly understood what he'd done. But I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and moving forward doesn't mean forgetting the lessons you've learned. The most important lesson is this: no one has the right to decide your fate for you, no matter what their relationship to you might be. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love, respect, and the willingness to protect each other's dignity, even when it's difficult. I survived because I refused to accept their version of who I was. I fought back because I remembered who I'd been before they started poisoning my body and my mind. And I found peace because I learned that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is walking away from people who don't deserve access to your life. The sunset over the Atlantic tonight is particularly beautiful, painted in shades of gold and pink that Margaret would have loved. Eleanor squeezes my hand and suggests we walk down to the water before it gets dark. As we make our way across the sand, I realize that this is what victory looks like. Not revenge or punishment, but the simple, profound joy of being free to choose your own path, to love and be loved honestly, and to wake up each morning knowing that no one else controls your destiny. I am Stephen Holloway. I am 74 years old, and I am finally completely free.